Part 6, Disease as Failed Resolution. Chapter 17, Chronic Inflammation as Resolution Failure. Chronic inflammation is usually described as if the body were simply generating too much inflammatory force for too long. That description is not completely wrong, but it remains shallow because it places the emphasis on excess rather than on sequence. The deeper problem in many chronic conditions is not that the body can still initiate inflammation. It is that the body cannot complete inflammation well enough to restore tissue order. The machinery of initiation remains available. Membranes still release arachidonic acid. Eicosanoid cascades still form. Cytokines still rise. Neutrophils still arrive. Endothelial surfaces still open. Pain pathways still amplify. What is impaired is the later phase that should bring recruitment under control, clear apoptotic cells and oxidized debris, restore barrier function, reduce inflammatory tone, and shift tissue from emergency logic back into maintenance and repair. Chronic inflammation is therefore better understood as resolution failure than as inflammatory excess alone. The body is still entering defense, is simply not exiting defense cleanly enough to stop defending. That distinction matters because it changes what chronic tissue looks like mechanistically. A chronically inflamed site is not merely a place with too many inflammatory molecules floating around. It is a place where the evidence of unfinished defense remains visible. Dead cells have not been cleared efficiently enough. Oxidized membrane fragments remain in the extracellular environment. Macrophages have not completed enough efferocytosis to empty the site of inflammatory residue. Endothelial behavior has not normalized enough to stop permissive immune traffic. Epithelial barriers have not resealed enough to stop feeding the tissue new provocation. Mitochondria have not restored enough energetic control to fund reconstruction. In this condition, the body is not behaving irrationally when it continues inflammatory signaling. It is responding to a site that still looks unresolved. Chronic inflammation persists because the tissue remains structurally legible as unfinished danger. This is why the concept of overinitiation remains incomplete unless it is linked to failed resolution. A body can become too easy to activate, but that ease of activation becomes especially damaging when every inflammatory event leaves behind residue that lowers the threshold for the next one. The tissue is repeatedly pushed into initiation, but each cycle also weakens its ability to complete. Neutrophil infiltration continues too long. Cleanup lags. Oxidative damage accumulates. Omega-3 derived substrate is too sparse, too weakly converted, or too poorly protected to generate enough specialized pro-resolving mediator pressure. The next trigger then lands in a tissue already carrying the debris, membrane instability, and biochemical memory of the last trigger. Chronic inflammation is not one prolonged event in the simplest sense. It is often a series of incompletely finished events layered on top of one another until the tissue never truly returns to baseline between them. This framework also explains why so many chronic inflammatory disorders present with both activation and exhaustion at the same time. The person may have pain, swelling, fatigue, brain fog, vascular irritation, poor recovery, and exaggerated reactivity to minor inputs, yet also show signs of depleted repair capacity, metabolic fragility, and low resilience. That apparent contradiction makes sense once inflammation is seen as resolution failure. The body is still spending on defense, but it is not collecting the return that resolution would normally provide. Energy keeps being used for surveillance, recruitment, and containment, while cleanup and reconstruction remain incomplete. The tissue stays metabolically expensive because it keeps living in a state that should have been temporary. Chronic inflammation, therefore, is not just immune overactivity. It is chronic incomplete work. This is where membrane composition becomes decisive. A tissue built under omega-6 dominance, poor omega-3 incorporation, oxidative instability, and repeated inflammatory stress is structurally biased toward initiation and underbuilt for completion. Its phospholipid reservoir carries more substrate for early-phase eicosanoid production and less substrate for strong downstream generation of resolvins, protectins, and maresins. Its membranes are easier to damage. Its receptors interpret danger through less stable surfaces. Its mitochondrial output becomes less reliable under load. Even before a visible flare occurs, the tissue has already lost part of its resolution potential. Chronic inflammation in that setting is not just a failure of signaling discipline. It is a failure of inflammatory architecture. The tissue does not possess enough protected later phase capacity to finish what the earlier phase machinery keeps starting. This is also why chronic inflammation is so often multisystemic. Once resolution failure takes hold, the body does not merely carry local symptoms. It carries altered thresholds across multiple tissues. Gut barriers remain more permeable. Vascular surfaces remain more reactive. Adipose tissue remains more immune active. Neural tissue remains more sensitized. Joints remain more debris-laden. Muscles recover more slowly. Sleep destabilizes more easily because nociceptive and cytokine tone remain elevated. The person experiences these as separate problems, but they are often different expressions of the same deeper pattern. Inflammation entered, did not complete, and left behind a tissue environment that now behaves as though fresh escalation is still easier than closure. Chronicity spreads because unresolved tissue does not keep its costs to itself. Seen clearly, this chapter marks a conceptual correction. Chronic inflammation should not be treated only as too much fire. It should be treated as fire that did not go out properly because the system failed to execute the phase of biology responsible for ending it. That changes what counts as progress. Lowering inflammatory markers is not enough if debris remains uncleared. Reducing pain is not enough if the tissue remains structurally unstable. Improving one symptom is not enough if the membrane reservoir still favors initiation and the barrier still leaks new triggers into the site. Real improvement means rebuilding resolution capacity. It means stronger omega-3 derived substrate pools, better downstream SPM production, better macrophage-led cleanup, better mitochondrial support, better membrane protection, and better barrier closure. Chronic inflammation is not only a problem of too much inflammatory signaling. It is a problem of too little successful completion. That is the lens through which the rest of the book must now be read. Persistent cytokine signaling. Persistent cytokine signaling is one of the clearest expressions of failed resolution because cytokines are not only markers of inflammation. They are part of the reason an inflammatory site continues behaving as though the job is unfinished. In an acute, well-sequenced response, cytokines help coordinate the early and middle phases of inflammation. They amplify danger recognition, recruit immune cells, alter endothelial behavior, change tissue metabolism, and make the inflammatory event large enough to matter. That is useful at the beginning because force has to be organized quickly. But cytokines are not supposed to remain the dominant language of the tissue indefinitely. Once the useful phase has passed, their persistence means the site has not transitioned successfully into closure. The body keeps receiving biochemical messages that the emergency is still active, and tissue behavior continues to reflect those messages even when the original trigger should already be moving toward completion. This is why persistent cytokine signaling is not best understood as a separate problem floating above the rest of the inflammatory sequence. It is tied directly to unresolved debris, unresolved membrane damage, unresolved barrier dysfunction, and unresolved immune traffic. Cytokines remain elevated because the tissue still contains the physical evidence of danger. Apoptotic cells are not cleared fast enough. Oxidized lipids remain embedded in membranes or extracellular debris. Endothelial and epithelial surfaces remain too open. Macrophages remain too incomplete in their cleanup role. Fresh immune-provoking material continues reaching the site through damaged barriers. Under those conditions, cytokines do exactly what they were designed to do. They continue coordinating an environment that still looks unfinished. The problem is not that cytokines exist. The problem is that the tissue keeps giving them reasons to remain relevant. Persistent cytokine signaling also lowers thresholds across the system. A tissue living under ongoing cytokine pressure becomes easier to activate and harder to calm. Endothelial surfaces become more adhesive. Nociceptive pathways remain more sensitized. Hepatic metabolism remains more inflammatory in tone. Mitochondrial stress can increase because the cell is repeatedly being pushed toward defensive rather than restorative priorities. Appetite, sleep, mood, energy, vascular tone, and cognitive resilience all begin to reflect a body that is interpreting itself through chronic inflammatory messaging. This is why persistent cytokines often correlate with symptoms that seem diffuse or systemic. The person is not just dealing with one inflamed site. They are dealing with an organism whose background signaling has shifted toward unfinished defense. This is also where specialized pro-resolving mediators become especially relevant. SPMs do not simply quiet cytokines directly as though muting a speaker. They help remove the underlying reasons cytokine signaling remains active. They reduce continued neutrophil recruitment, improve macrophage-led efferocytosis, limit collateral tissue injury, and support barrier restoration and vascular normalization. As the tissue becomes physically cleaner and less structurally dangerous, cytokine signaling loses its justification. The environment no longer needs the same level of inflammatory coordination because the evidence of unresolved threat has begun to disappear. This is why resolution biology is more powerful than blunt suppression in this context. Suppression may lower cytokine output transiently. Resolution lowers the need for that output by changing the tissue itself. Seen clearly, persistent cytokine signaling is one of the ways chronic inflammation keeps declaring that it has not reached its end state. The tissue continues speaking the language of emergency because emergency-like conditions remain in place. Until debris is cleared, membranes stabilized, barriers repaired, and omega-3 derived resolution pathways strengthened enough to help the site complete its inflammatory sequence, cytokine signaling tends to remain part of the background. The body is not just inflamed. It is being continually instructed to stay inflamed. Incomplete debris clearance. Incomplete debris clearance is one of the most important reasons inflammation becomes chronic, because tissue cannot convincingly exit defense while it is still physically carrying the remains of the event it is trying to finish. Debris is not passive residue. It includes apoptotic neutrophils that were not engulfed in time, fragments of damaged cell membranes, oxidized phospholipids, denatured proteins, extracellular matrix breakdown products, and other remnants of tissue injury and immune activity. As long as that material remains in place, the inflammatory site continues to present itself as unfinished. Receptors on macrophages, endothelial cells, epithelial cells, and other neighboring structures keep encountering evidence that something is still wrong. The body does not stand down because the tissue has not yet become quiet enough, clean enough, or structurally restored enough to justify standing down. Incomplete clearance therefore keeps the inflammatory program open from the inside. This is why debris clearance is not a minor housekeeping detail that happens after the real immune work is done. It is part of the real immune work. Early inflammation creates disruption on purpose. Neutrophils arrive, release oxidants and enzymes, damaged host cells die, extracellular proteins are altered, lipids oxidize, and the tissue environment becomes chemically crowded. That phase can be necessary, but once the acute objective has been achieved, all of that material has to be removed if the site is going to stop behaving like a place under attack. If clearance lags, the inflammatory response becomes self-perpetuating. Yesterday's neutrophils become today's inflammatory stimulus. Yesterday's oxidized membrane fragments become today's danger signals. The body keeps reading the site through the remains of its own unfinished work. Macrophages sit at the center of this problem because they are the main cells responsible for turning inflammatory residue into biological closure. Through efferocytosis and related cleanup functions, they remove apoptotic cells before those cells lose membrane integrity and spill their contents into the surrounding tissue. They internalize membrane remnants, oxidized lipids, and other debris that would otherwise continue stimulating inflammatory interpretation. When macrophage cleanup is efficient, the site becomes less visibly dangerous to the immune system. When macrophage cleanup is weak, overwhelmed, or mistimed, the site becomes trapped in chemical repetition. Debris remains present long enough to transform from waste into renewed provocation. This is one of the main ways resolution failure becomes chronicity. The consequences of incomplete clearance extend beyond inflammation in the narrow sense. A debris-laden tissue remains metabolically expensive. It continues attracting immune surveillance. It keeps vascular surfaces more reactive. It prolongs nociceptive signaling because pain pathways keep receiving evidence that the area is still unsafe. It interferes with repair because new structure is being laid down into an environment still crowded with the molecular signs of old damage. A tissue cannot regenerate cleanly while it is still full of unresolved fragments from the previous phase. In that sense, incomplete debris clearance does not just delay healing. It actively contaminates the conditions required for healing. This is also why specialized pro-resolving mediators matter so much here. Their importance is not just that they reduce future inflammatory recruitment. They improve the tissue's ability to finish the current event by enhancing macrophage cleanup, supporting efferocytosis, limiting further collateral damage, and helping the site shift away from repeated reinforcement. A body with weak SPM biology often does not simply inflame more. It clears worse. The tissue then remains full of inflammatory leftovers, which keeps cytokine signaling alive, keeps barriers unstable, and lowers the threshold for the next flare. Incomplete debris clearance is therefore one of the central physical expressions of failed resolution. The body is still inflamed because it is still surrounded by the material proof that inflammation has not actually been completed. Tissue damage accumulation. Tissue damage accumulation is what happens when inflammatory events keep producing structural injury faster than the body can clear, repair, and reorganize the site back into a stable state. This is one of the main reasons chronic inflammation becomes progressive rather than merely repetitive. A single inflammatory event always carries some cost. Membranes are stressed. Proteins are oxidized or degraded. Extracellular matrix is altered. Vascular behavior shifts. Immune cells enter, act, and die. Under ideal conditions, those costs are paid back during resolution. Debris is removed, membranes are rebuilt, barriers are restored, and the tissue returns to a lower noise state. When resolution fails, that repayment does not happen fully. The tissue carries part of the injury forward. Then the next inflammatory event begins on top of that residue. Over time, the body is no longer responding from clean baseline structure. It is responding from accumulated damage. This accumulated damage changes the meaning of future triggers. A tissue with repeated membrane oxidation, persistent debris, altered vascular surfaces, and incomplete repair is easier to activate because it already looks partially unsafe. Receptors encounter more danger-associated material. Barriers are weaker. Macrophages are more burdened. Mitochondria are more strained. The threshold for new inflammatory activation drops because the tissue never fully stopped presenting evidence of previous injury. This is why chronic inflammatory states often intensify gradually even when no single new trigger seems dramatically worse. The body is dealing not only with the present insult, but with the layered cost of the insults that were never properly finished before it. Tissue damage accumulation also distorts function before it produces obvious structural failure. In vascular tissue, it may appear as persistent endothelial reactivity, abnormal permeability, or reduced nitric oxide handling. In joints, it may appear as longer recovery, stiffness, and recurring irritation because inflammatory residue and matrix damage were not fully cleared. In the nervous system, it may appear as persistent sensitization, cognitive instability, altered mood regulation, or poor stress tolerance because synaptic and glial environments remain biochemically noisy. In barrier tissues, it may appear as exaggerated reactivity and repeated immune provocation because the surface never fully reestablished selective control. The damage accumulates as altered behavior first. Only later does it become easier to recognize as more obvious pathology. This is one of the deepest reasons specialized pro-resolving mediators matter. They do not just reduce the intensity of the current inflammatory response. They help prevent current inflammation from becoming future structural burden. By reducing continued neutrophil recruitment, improving macrophage cleanup, limiting collateral injury, and supporting repair-compatible tissue transitions, SPMs lower the amount of damage that gets carried into the next cycle. A body with weak resolution capacity accumulates injury because every event leaves behind more than it should. A body with stronger resolution capacity still experiences stress and still inflames when necessary, but it finishes with less residue. That difference becomes enormous over time. Seen clearly, tissue damage accumulation is the material memory of failed resolution. It is how chronic inflammation leaves a record inside the tissue itself. The body keeps getting easier to trigger because the site keeps carrying the leftovers of previous unfinished defense. Until that accumulation is reduced through better cleanup, better membrane protection, better barrier restoration, and stronger resolution biology, each new inflammatory event starts from a worse position than the last. That is how chronic inflammation stops being just a signaling problem and becomes a structural problem. The stuck inflammation state. The stuck inflammation state is what the body looks like when it never fully exits the inflammatory program, even if the original trigger has partially faded or changed form. It is not the same as acute inflammation, and it is not simply the presence of inflammatory markers in the blood. It is a tissue condition in which initiation remains easier than completion, cleanup remains slower than residue generation, and repair remains too weak to restore a true baseline before the next round of activation begins. The body in this state does not experience inflammation as a clean episode with a beginning, middle, and end. It experiences inflammation as a semi-permanent operating mode. The tissue is no longer fully in crisis, but it is not fully out of crisis either. It remains partially recruited, partially permeable, partially oxidized, partially sensitized, and structurally unfinished enough that normal life keeps re-triggering the same defensive logic. What makes this state so important is that it explains why chronic illness often feels diffuse, recurring, and disproportionate. In stuck inflammation, the body still knows how to launch force. Neutrophils still arrive. Cytokines still rise. Eicosanoids still form. Pain pathways still amplify. Endothelial surfaces still open. But the back half of the sequence never takes command strongly enough. Macrophages do not clear debris efficiently enough. Specialized pro-resolving mediator output is too weak relative to the inflammatory burden. Membranes remain oxidatively unstable. Barriers remain too open. Mitochondria remain too strained to fund real completion. The result is a body that keeps defending because it never receives convincing structural evidence that the event has ended. The site still looks dangerous, so the system keeps behaving as though danger is present. This is why the stuck inflammation state is so often mistaken for random symptom variability. A person may have days that are better and days that are worse, but the underlying tissue never becomes truly normal between them. Pain may recede but not disappear in a biologically complete way because local nociceptive amplification remains justified by unresolved debris and membrane instability. Fatigue may improve somewhat but return quickly because the body remains metabolically committed to surveillance and partial defense. Gut symptoms may quiet temporarily, but flare with minor dietary stress because the barrier never fully restabilized. Brain fog may lighten but recur because the neural environment remains too chemically noisy to sustain precision under pressure. These fluctuations are not random. They reflect a system oscillating inside an incomplete inflammatory program rather than moving fully beyond it. The phrase stuck is useful because it captures the fact that the body is not simply inflamed harder. It is inflamed unfinished. The machinery of escalation and the machinery of closure are no longer proportionate. Too much of the tissue's biology is still organized around the front half of the response. Omega-6 derived initiation substrate remains abundant. COX and LOX traffic remains biased toward early phase chemistry. SPM generation remains too weak or too poorly expressed. Debris remains visible. Thresholds remain low. Each new stressor lands in a body already leaning toward activation. That is why the same tissue can feel both exhausted and overreactive at once. Is spending on defense without receiving the restoration that should follow defense. Seen clearly, the stuck inflammation state is the lived physiology of resolution failure. It is what happens when the body loses the ability to convincingly declare an inflammatory event complete. The answer is not simply to silence symptoms harder. The deeper requirement is to rebuild the conditions that allow completion: better membrane composition, stronger omega-3, derived resolution substrate, better downstream conversion into SPMs, better macrophage cleanup, lower oxidative damage, tighter barriers, and enough mitochondrial capacity to pay for repair. Until those conditions improve, the body remains what it appears to be in this state, not fully sick in one acute moment, but not fully recovered from a last one either.